Picture the scene on July 2nd, 1943, above the Castelvetrano airfield in Sicily, where the pilot of a Focke-Wulf 190 never saw the P-40 Warhawk diving from above until machine gun fire tore through his fuselage. As the German aircraft spiraled toward the countryside below, First Lieutenant Charles B. Hall, a 22-year-old native of Brazil, Indiana, had just recorded what Luftwaffe commanders believed to be impossible. A black pilot had successfully shot down one of their elite fighter aircraft. You must understand the significance of the swastika painted on Hall's P-40L Warhawk that afternoon, as it would become the first of 112 enemy aircraft destroyed by the men the Germans would come to call Schwarze Vogelmenschen, or the Black Birdmen. In Nazi Germany, racial doctrine classified black people as Untermenschen, subhuman beings, supposedly incapable of mastering complex machinery or demonstrating courage in combat. Yet here, above the Mediterranean, that ideology was colliding catastrophically with reality. 992 trained pilots from Tuskegee, Alabama were systematically demolishing both German aircraft and the enemy's assumptions about racial superiority, a fact the Luftwaffe pilots were just beginning to realize. As they climbed to intercept American bombers in 1943, they were unaware that they were about to face some of the most rigorously trained and highly motivated fighter pilots in the entire United States Army Air Forces. Men who had overcome obstacles their white counterparts never had to face. These airmen carried into battle not just the weight of national duty, but the heavy burden of proving an entire race's capability, and the mathematics of aerial combat would soon be written across the skies of Europe. When you look at the record, 15,000 combat sorties, 1,578 missions, 112 aerial victories, and a bomber escort loss rate significantly lower than white fighter groups, you see statistics that forced even the most fanatical Nazi ideologues to confront the bankruptcy of their racial theories. To understand the magnitude of this victory, you have to look back to where the journey began, not in combat, but in the hostile environment of American segregation. In 1925, the U.S. Army War College published a report titled Employment of Negro Manpower in War, which concluded that compared to the white man, the black soldier was of inferior mentality and inherently weak in character, claiming they lacked the intelligence for technical roles and the courage for combat leadership. Yet, even as military leaders clung to these prejudices, you can see a small group of black Americans already proving them wrong, such as Eugene Bullard, who flew for France in World War I because America refused his service. Bessie Coleman earned her pilot's license in France in 1921 when no American flight school would accept her. And by the 1930s, the Coffey School of Aeronautics in Chicago was training dozens of black civilian pilots, demonstrating that flying skill knew no racial boundaries. As war clouds gathered over Europe, the pressure for change intensified through the relentless lobbying of civil rights leaders like Walter White of the NAACP, labor leader A. Philip Randolph, and Judge William H. Hastie. Black newspapers, including the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, and the Baltimore Afro-American, hammered the Roosevelt administration with a simple, piercing question. How could America fight for democracy abroad while denying it to its citizens at home? The door finally cracked open on April 3, 1939, when Senator Harry H. Schwartz inserted an amendment to Public Law 18 requiring the civilian pilot training program to designate schools for the training of black air pilots. It was a grudging concession, wrapped in segregation, but as Franklin Roosevelt ran for an unprecedented third term in 1940 and needed black votes in key northern cities, it marked a critical beginning. On January 16, 1941, Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson announced the formation of the 99th Pursuit Squadron, an all-black flying unit, though the announcement came with a caveat that revealed the military's expectations. This was an experiment to test whether blacks could actually be trained as combat pilots. Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. understood the weight of command when he led 26 pilots to North Africa in April 1943, having already endured 4 years of silence at West Point, where no white cadet spoke to him outside of duty. The 99th arrived at Farjuna, Tunisia, attached to the 33rd Fighter Group under Colonel William W. Momire, a commander who made no secret of his skepticism about black pilots and assigned them patrol missions far from the real action. You can see that he effectively wanted them to fail, yet during their first combat mission on June 2, 1943, over the Italian-held island of Pantelleria, they held formation under fire, protecting their bombers and proving they would not break under pressure. But it was that fateful day of July 2, 1943, that changed everything during Charles Hall's 8th mission escorting B-25 Mitchell bombers attacking the Castelvetrano airfield. When two Focke-Wulf 190s bore down on the formation, Hall maneuvered into the space between the fighters and bombers, turning inside the enemy aircraft and firing a long burst that sent the German fighter plummeting into the ground, cementing a victory that rewrote history. When Charles Hall touched down on the runway, the entire airbase erupted in jubilation, as the black ground crews, who had silently weathered months of racial insults, finally possessed a definitive answer to every slight they had endured. This victory marked the first confirmed aerial kill by a black American pilot in the history of the United States military, yet the celebration was shadowed by a looming political threat. Despite the 99th Fighter Squadron's 7 months of combat duty, Colonel Momire had filed a scathing report, alleging a lack of aggressiveness and recommending their removal from the front lines, a document that prompted General Henry Hap Arnold to prepare the orders that would terminate the experiment entirely. Lieutenant Roscoe Brown, having meticulously analyzed the jet's mechanics, executed a tactical counter-move by turning into the enemy's blind spots rather than chasing their superior speed. Brown destroyed one jet with a burst from 2,000 feet, while Lieutenant Earl Lane achieved a seemingly impossible feat by downing a second ME-262 using the advanced K-14 computing gun sight. With Lieutenant Charles Brantley claiming a third victory, the group destroyed more jets in a single afternoon than most units managed throughout the entire war, earning a distinguished unit citation for exceeding the total of all previous American jet kills combined. However, the conflict exacted a heavy toll, and the experiences of the 32 Tuskegee pilots taken as prisoners of war revealed a chilling intersection of Nazi ideology and military intelligence. When Lieutenant Alexander Jefferson was shot down over southern France on August 12, 1944, he was stunned during his interrogation to find the German officer possessed intimate knowledge of the unit. The interrogator not only knew the details of Ramitelli Airfield and the squadron commanders, but also recited specifics about Jefferson's parents and their home in Detroit, demonstrating a level of enemy surveillance that was frighteningly thorough. Inside Stalag Luft 3, Alexander Jefferson found himself being treated with the same respect accorded to any other captured American officer. White prisoners of war from bomber crews frequently approached him, eager to express their gratitude for the protection the Red Tails had provided. These interactions, which would have been impossible in a segregated America, occurred naturally within the confines of German prison camps. The irony of the situation was distinct to Jefferson. He realized he was experiencing greater equality as a prisoner in a Nazi camp surrounded by white Americans than he would back home. This reality was starkly confirmed when the war ended and he returned to the United States, only to be immediately segregated the moment he disembarked. Although German pilots reportedly acknowledged the skill of the Red Tails, referring to them by the nickname Schwarze Vogelmännchen, it was the American bomber crews who became their most vocal champions. For these men, who faced the specter of death on every mission, racial prejudice meant nothing. They cared only about survival. The bomber crews developed a unique mythology surrounding the Red Tails, spreading stories about their distinctive flying style and the way they waggled their wings in greeting. They spoke of the fighters' tight formations and their absolute refusal to abandon damaged heavy bombers, affectionately naming their protectors the Red Tail Angels. Historical statistics firmly supported the bomber crew's preference for these escorts. Research by Air Force historian Dr. Daniel Hallman revealed that bombers escorted by the 332nd Fighter Group lost only 27 aircraft to enemy fighters, compared to an average of 46 for other P-51 groups within the 15th Air Force. This superior protection rate was maintained despite the fact that the Red Tails flew some of the longest and most dangerous missions of the entire war. By the time the conflict ended, the Tuskegee Airmen had compiled a combat record that effectively demolished every pre-war assumption regarding black military capability. Their operational record was staggering, comprising 1,578 combat missions and more than 15,000 individual sorties. Specifically, the group completed 179 bomber escort missions and 311 missions for the 15th Air Force. In terms of aerial supremacy, they destroyed 112 enemy aircraft in combat and another 150 on the ground. A notable achievement occurred on March 24, 1945, when they shot down 3 Me-262 jet fighters. Their devastation of ground targets was equally impressive, accounting for 950 destroyed rail cars, trucks, and motor vehicles, as well as 254 locomotive engines. Additionally, on June 25, 1944, they damaged the former Italian destroyer Giuseppe Missouri, designated TA-22, beyond repair. Their protection record remained their crowning achievement, with only 27 bombers lost to enemy fighters, versus the average of 46 for other groups. This superior rate of protection was consistently maintained across 179 separate escort missions. Individual pilots achieved remarkable success, with Lee Archer and Joseph Ellsbury each claiming 4 confirmed victories. Ellsbury included 3 FW-190s among his kills on July 12, 1944. Edward Toppins also secured 4 victories, while Clarence Lester achieved 3 kills in a single mission on July 18, 1944. The unit earned a vast array of decorations, including 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses and 744 air medals for the pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group. Furthermore, they received 14 Bronze Stars, 8 Purple Hearts, and Distinguished Unit Citations for both the 99th Fighter Squadron and the 332nd Fighter Group. This success came at a heavy human cost, with 66 pilots killed in action and 32 captured as prisoners of war. Additionally, 84 lives were lost during training and non-combat missions, underscoring the dangers inherent in their service. The transformation of the Red Tails' reputation from mockery to respect was not solely due to their courage, but also their superior American training methods and technological advantages. At Tuskegee, pilots flew 300 hours compared to the 200 typical for white pilots, obsessively practicing formation flying because they understood that discipline would be their edge in combat. The selection process was rigorous, with a washout rate at Tuskegee of 60% compared to 40% for white cadets. Only the absolute best survived the program, creating what Colonel Noel Parrish, the Tuskegee commander, described as a super-selected group. The progression of aircraft types told its own story, as the 99th began with hand-me-down P-40 Warhawks that were already obsolete upon their arrival in North Africa. These liquid-cooled, Allison-engined fighters were inferior to German Bf-109s and FW-190s in nearly every performance metric. Yet the pilots utilized the P-40's turning ability and ruggedness to hold their own. The arrival of P-51 Mustangs in July 1944 transformed the Red Tails into the equals of any fighter unit in the war. The North American P-51D Mustang represented the pinnacle of American industrial perfection, featuring a Packard-built Merlin engine that propelled it to a top speed of 437 miles per hour. Armed with 6 50-caliber machine guns capable of destroying any aircraft, the Mustang's most vital asset was its range. Capable of flying over 1,600 miles with drop tanks, it allowed the Red Tails to escort bombers to any target within the Reich. Behind every pilot who downed a German aircraft stood dozens of support personnel, including mechanics, armorers, and crew chiefs, who kept the Red Tails flying. Of the approximately 16,000 Tuskegee Airmen who served, fewer than 1,000 were pilots. The rest were the unsung heroes who made victory possible. These ground crews worked miracles with limited resources, particularly at Ramitelli Airfield in Italy, which was primitive compared to other American bases. Despite spare parts being scarce and the 332nd often being last in line for supplies, their aircraft availability rate equaled or exceeded that of white units. The ground crews also faced the realities of combat. Although German raids on Ramitelli were rare, they were deadly. On March 24, 1944, a German bombing raid killed several support personnel. Yet the men continued working through the attack to pull aircraft away from burning fuel dumps. The strategic bombing campaign over Europe provided the ultimate testing ground for the Tuskegee Airmen. With each B-17 Flying Fortress costing $238,000 and carrying 10 highly trained crew members, the loss of a single bomber represented a strategic setback that rippled to the entire war effort. This high value explains why bomber protection mattered more than aerial victories. Colonel Davis understood this clearly when he ordered his pilots to resist the temptation to chase German fighters, stating that anyone can shoot down a fighter if they abandon their post, but it takes discipline to stay with the bombers when the enemy is running. The Red Tails' escort tactics evolved through this experience, eventually developing into a comprehensive 3-layer defense. The aerial defense strategy employed by the group was a masterclass in coordination. Close escorts wove directly above the bombers, a medium-altitude layer swept the skies to intercept incoming fighters, and a high-altitude contingent watched vigilantly for diving attacks. Maintaining this complex system required absolute discipline, yet these pilots were fighting 2 wars simultaneously, one against fascism overseas and another against systemic racism back home. Their exemplary combat record served as a direct rebuttal to both Nazi racial ideology and American segregation, proving definitively that excellence in the cockpit transcended all racial categorizations. While the Tuskegee Airmen were defeating German forces abroad, they were also engaged in a relentless battle against prejudice within their own borders. Although their victories over the Luftwaffe generated bold headlines in African-American newspapers, the mainstream press frequently minimized these accomplishments or ignored them entirely. The Pittsburgh Courier used the pilots as the centerpiece of its Double V campaign, advocating for a dual victory against tyranny abroad and oppression at home, highlighting the stark contrast between their heroism and their treatment in the United States. There was a jarring disparity between how the enemy perceived these pilots and the ignorance of the American public. By 1945, the Luftwaffe reportedly knew exactly who was flying the red-tailed Mustangs, referring to them as Schwarz-Vogelmenschen, or black birdmen. Meanwhile, a significant portion of white Americans remained unaware that black pilots even existed, a gap in knowledge that was deliberately cultivated by the War Department's reluctance to publicize the group's successes. For the Tuskegee Airmen, victory in Europe brought uncertainty rather than the celebration afforded to their white counterparts. While other units prepared for victory parades, the 332nd Fighter Group faced difficult questions about their future, as the Army Air Forces intended to maintain segregation despite combat evidence of its absurdity. Consequently, for decades following the Second World War, the profound achievements of these airmen remained largely erased from the mainstream American historical narrative. Individual pilots felt the weight of this erasure deeply. Lee Archer, for instance, attained 4 aerial victories, yet rarely spoke of his war record during his later career as an executive. He famously remarked that sharing his story felt futile because people simply assumed that a black fighter pilot must be lying. It was not until 1948 that President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981 to desegregate the military, a historic decision driven in significant part by the undeniable combat performance of the Tuskegee Airmen. Official recognition arrived with agonizing slowness, exemplified by Benjamin Davis, who led the Red Tails over Berlin and eventually became the Air Force's first black general in 1954. However, it took until 2007 for the nation to fully express its gratitude, when President George W. Bush awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the group. By that time, only 300 of the original pilots were still alive to attend the ceremony, having waited more than 60 years for their country to acknowledge their service. The transformation of their public image from objects of mockery to icons of respect is based not on mythology, but on documented facts and irrefutable numbers. The statistics tell the story. 112 confirmed aerial victories against the Luftwaffe, the destruction of 3 Me-262 jet fighters in a single mission, and the annihilation of 150 enemy aircraft on the ground. They earned 96 distinguished flying crosses and lost only 27 bombers, a figure significantly lower than the average of 46 lost by other escort groups. Those whom the enemy called the Black Birdmen proved that prejudice crumbles when confronted with absolute competence. Every German fighter destroyed and every bomber protected added weight to the irrefutable case that the color of a pilot's skin had absolutely no bearing on their ability to fly and fight. Roscoe Brown, who was credited with shooting down a German jet over Berlin, summarized their legacy by noting that they didn't just fight the Germans, they fought ignorance, prejudice, and hatred, and they emerged victorious in all 3 battles. Ultimately, the Tuskegee Airmen did more than win skirmishes. They fundamentally altered the course of history. They fought 3 simultaneous wars and won them all, defeating the Luftwaffe in combat, dismantling Nazi racial ideology through their performance, and eventually helping to demolish American segregation through their undeniable excellence. When finally given the opportunity, they soared, transforming mockery into respect, prejudice into acceptance, and forcing their enemies to become witnesses to their extraordinary achievement.